What's up, everybody? This is John Odermatt, the host of Felony Friday, and before we get rolling into today's show, I want to take a quick moment to talk about coffee. That's right, coffee. The Lions of Liberty, we have partnered up with Anarcho Coffee, and we are selling our very own coffee. It's called the Morning Roar. It is a medium dark roast that has cupping notes of lemon lime, caramel, black pepper, and brown sugar. It is delicious. You can pick up some of this coffee by going to lionsofliberty.com/coffee. We have a way there on your first purchase. You can get 10% off, but if you join the Pride for $10 and up, you can actually get more than that. You can get 15% off every single order. Buy some coffee, support the Lions of Liberty, support another great libertarian company as well. Everybody wins. lionsofliberty.com/coffee.
Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers. Yes, you too, freedom lovers. Gather around the table, gather around the speaker, gather around your iPhone or whatever you're listening on. This is another episode of Felony Friday, the only show out there that focuses every single week on exposing the injustice that people in this country, the United States of America, suffer. And also we talk about injustice around the world too, but mostly in the United States of America. And also, in addition to focusing on injustice, we bring you stories of individuals who have overcome tremendous obstacles, tremendous odds in their fight to add value to society, to contribute, to create a life after prison where they are able to give back and help to change the system that wronged them. Today's episode of Felony Friday is a fantastic one. I'm going to tell you a bit about it in just a minute. Before I do that, just want to remind you, this is one of 3 shows we have on Felony Friday. We kick off every week with a show on Monday, hosted by Mark Claire. It's our flagship program where Mark interviews leaders in the libertarian movement. And every Wednesday, we have Electric Liberty Land, hosted by Brian McWilliams. It's your weekly shot of culture, comedy, and liberty. You can get all 3 of these shows delivered to your fancy little listening device that you carry around in your pocket. Some people refer to it as a cell phone. I like to refer to it as my social media scrolling device. But you can access our podcast. You can have those automatically delivered to your phone just by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, whatever your favorite podcasting app is. I don't know what it is. I can't read your mind. So just go, click subscribe. You'll get each of our shows delivered to your device. Today's episode of Felony Friday got a fantastic show. Have Warren Stelman. He's an author. He's a guy who's been to prison. He's got a crazy story he's going to tell. So crazy that he wrote a book about it. So this episode is 181. That means the show notes page can be found at lionsofliberty.com/FF181. Let's jump right into today's show. My guest today on Felony Friday is Warren Stelman. He is the author of a book called Gorilla Tango, From Businessman to Convicted Felon and Surviving the U.S. Prison System. Back in 2013, Warren was sentenced to 75 months in prison for participating in a Dominican-based telemarketing fraud scheme. Warren's book shares about his journey all the way through his hellish conditions that he suffered down in the Dominican, in that third world prison system down there, and then 14 months in a Supermax MCC in New York, and 4 more years in the U.S. federal prison system. So Warren, welcome to Felony Friday.
Hello, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm sure it's great to be out of prison, all you've been through, when did you get out? How many years ago did you get out?
I got released a year and a half ago, January of 2018.
Okay. And you're up in Canada now, right?
I'm in Montreal, in Canada.
So before we get into your story, because, obviously you wrote a book about it. It's a crazy story. Lots of things happen. We'll get into some of those, but just to sort of set the table, set the stage so people get to know a little bit about you. If you could just kind of rewind the clock and talk a little bit about what your life was like before, shit hit the fan and stuff got crazy, but before, anything in the Dominican or any of that. So what was going on in your life at that point in time?
Listen, I grew up in Montreal, and I went to school. I went to university. I got into business at a young age. I was, pretty successful at an earlier age, and I got married when I was 29. My wife and I had 4 children, and life was pretty good. Living a nice life, and in my 40s. Things started to unravel, my late 40s. And I was heavily invested in a business that ultimately failed. I described this in my book. And along with that sort of downward spiral, I began drinking heavily. I never drank. I never, did drugs or drank. And it started with, drinking when I was out entertaining customers for business, with wine. And it sort of... it gradually got worse and worse. So it was wine, with, wine, a glass of wine to fall asleep. And then it was wine with everything. And then ultimately vodka. And with the collapse of the business and ultimately led me down the road to get involved in this, shameful, in my opinion, then now, despicable sweepstakes fraud where, we stole money from people. Something I, forever, carry the shame of doing. And I was involved in that with my wife. So we went down to the Dominican Republic because somebody we knew was running this sweepstakes scam. We didn't know we were going there for that initially, but we found out when we got there that that's what it was.
What did you think you were going there for?
Initially, I thought it was to sell time sharing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did you, when you say you went there, so you actually moved to the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, we got up. It was kind of it wasn't a absolutely permanent thing, but I was going down there to try and, try doing something. I had lost all my money. My life was in disarray. My wife and I actually got separated, but still we both went down, obviously in the pursuit of money. Mm-hmm. And, we got there, we still lived separately. But we started doing, what we did. And, we did it for a bit. And at some point, I understood my drinking was so out of control when I was living there. Mm-hmm. It was like shockingly out of control. And so I started to realize that I was going to die if I didn't do something about it.
Shocking out of control, meaning you're like just drinking constantly to that point?
Listen, man, I was waking up in the morning, like no exaggeration. First thing in the morning, it didn't matter what time, 6, 6:30, 7. The first thing I did was go to the freezer and start drinking vodka. And I drank all day long and all night long. And there wasn't a day that went by for a number of years where I didn't drink 40 ounces of vodka. I was at the brink of death. One of my kids showed me a picture that was taken back then before I quit drinking. Mm-hmm. And it was, I looked like a monster. So a few things happened living in Santo Domingo. It's a foreign country, and a few things happened that were, I was dangerously close to having serious problems. That could have, I could have ended up dying. And I realized, listen, I can't live like this. My kids were almost at the point of they weren't going to talk to me anymore. Fighting with my wife, committing this fraud that we were committing. It was all too much. And I said, I can't. And so I flew back to Montreal in 2010 and I went to AA and I quit drinking cold turkey and I never, drank again after that.
Wow.
So, I tell the story in the book. I don't want to give it all away, but, ultimately when I was sober, I was more capable once again. And I started pursuing other, legitimate, business ventures. And I started making money again and things were tracking. But then in 2012, the shit hit the fan. So probably a year and a half after we stopped doing what we were doing, we got arrested, my wife and I both.
Was there any hint, in that year and a half or any time before that, you thought you could get caught for it? Or did you, obviously you talk about your drinking, how out of control it was, so you probably weren't thinking properly at the time. But did you understand like the possible ramifications of what you were doing?
I mean, the notion that it could happen is all, it's in the back of your mind, but it's almost like it was in the big scheme of things. It was such a small thing, right? And so, no, I never in a million years, thought something like this. Even as things were happening that should have made me realize, oh, this could be about that. I still didn't, really focus on that. Mm-hmm. And we never had a chance because from the day my wife and I arrived there was already a confidential informant working in the office where we were. So we were cooked the day we got there.
Wow.
Yeah, the FBI already had a confidential informant in there. So we would just walk right into it.
So can you talk about how the arrest went down, how that played out? Because I know that was pretty crazy in itself.
Yeah, that's another chapter in the book. So we were it was August of 2012. We were going to the airport. We were going to fly back to Montreal. Now, we have 4 children. So our 2 younger ones were living with us in Santo Domingo. Mm-hmm. And they were going to school there, the American School of Santo Domingo. My 2 older daughters were in school here in university in Montreal. So we put them up in an apartment. And we were flying home that summer for 3 reasons. To obviously see the kids, first and foremost. My youngest, my son who lived in Santo Domingo, we sent him to summer camp in Montreal. So we were going back to pick him up also and bring him back to start school, at the end of August, September in Santo Domingo. And the third reason was my high school reunion. I'd never been to one. We were having a 37th high school reunion, I think it was at the time. And because of Facebook, people were coming from everywhere.
Right.
Those were the 3 reasons. When I got to the airport, they wouldn't let me get on the plane. I didn't know why. I thought it was related to my permanent residence status, which was about to be issued by the government. I had temporary residence. My wife and kids already had their permanent residence. So I told my wife and daughter, my youngest daughter at the time was 16, to go ahead. I'll figure this out. It must be related to that. I'll call a lawyer and just go and I'll meet you the next day. Mm-hmm. When my wife landed in Miami, the FBI was there and they arrested her in front of my 16-year-old daughter. So that was that. And I found out about it a few hours later. And that's just when the whole thing started. Mm-hmm. The arrest was on a major city street, downtown Santo Domingo. I was driving. I was in the passenger seat. Somebody who worked for me was driving. And they came out of everywhere, Interpol, in black SUVs. There had to be, I don't know, anywhere 10 to 20 of them. It's hard to remember exactly. Mm-hmm. It's kind of terrifying. Guns drawn.
Not to interrupt you, but do you have any idea why? So why would they let your wife get on the plane?
Till this day, I don't know. It's crazy, isn't it? Till this day, I don't have the answer to that. Huh. Did they want to separate us? Did they want to, keep her away from me? I mean, they would have had her away from me anyway if we were both arrested. It didn't make any sense because they could have arrested me on U.S. soil and they would have saved the extradition and all the expenses of getting me to the U.S. It didn't make any sense. It still doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I just don't.
It could be something. It could have been some stupid government bureaucracy where they couldn't get something approved.
I think it's probably entirely that. Yeah. Just a mistake, It sounds like that's typical.
So you get arrested then in Santo Domingo. What happens next from there?
I mean, they bring me to the Interpol offices where the FBI is waiting for me, and I spend the next few hours in interview whatever with them, and they're trying to get me to give them information. And, I wasn't about to give any information. I just wanted to see a lawyer. They told me, you'll get to see a lawyer eventually. And I think when it became clear to them I wasn't going to give any information, they left. Again, in my book, without giving too much away, but so the FBI said, just as they were leaving, Mr. Stelman, you'll be staying with the Dominicans in their jail. And usually most people that have, are subjected to that, call us and want to really help within 24 hours and talk to us. So, I said, okay. And it was kind of like obviously a sort of threat. And I said, yeah, well, all right. And he wasn't wrong about how bad it would be. So from there, they threw me in what I describe as, dungeons. And that's what they are. They're just horrific places.
Now, I know you probably go into more detail in the book about things that happened there. Can you give a snippet of something that did happen to you, or a piece of something that happened to you while you were in the Dominican prison?
I was in several of these, a couple of these different dungeons from over a period of, I think it was 2 weeks or just under 2 weeks. But, one of the things I describe in the book, I got the shit kicked out of me. I got jumped by 4 guys. At one point, it was over toilet paper and water. And so, that wasn't too nice. But the very first night, I was put in second night, I was put in this dungeon. I saw a young, I don't know how old, maybe 19, 20-year-old kid get beaten to death by another prisoner. And that was pretty shocking. In fact, after 6 years of prison and seeing a lot of violence, it's still probably the one thing that affects me the most. Wow. And I could still, sometimes thinking about it, still tear up. I guess it's because of the trauma of how shocking it was, to see initially. Over time, you sort of get more used to stuff like that when stuff pops off in prison. But that first time, it just it dug a hole somewhere in my, in my soul, and it's always hard for me to think about.
Yeah, that's crazy to see something like that firsthand. So eventually you do get extradited to the United States, and you're convicted, right? So what was your sentence? And were you and your wife, were you tried together? Was there a big group of you that were tried together? Or how did that work?
So no, firstly, I didn't go to trial, because if I went to trial, I'd still be in prison and we wouldn't be having this interview and my book wouldn't be published. It was clear to me, listen, I was guilty of my crime. There was no question about it. So there was never a question of, guilt or innocence. I was, guilty. I did it. And so it was just a question of trying to mitigate the amount of time I got. And so we pleaded, guilty, and we just, copped out. We took a plea agreement. I was hoping for, not much, but lesser sentence. The plea agreement was 63 to 78 months. Normally, when the probation office recommends the low end of the guideline range, usually the judge follows it. In my case, he didn't. So he gave me 75 months. My wife got 48 months. So she was home 2 years before I was. So, yeah, I did 75 months, which, the whole conspiracy was for less than $1 million. Yeah. So really, it's, by any other standard of any country anywhere, it's a crazy sentence. I'm not complaining. I'm not looking for sympathy. And I'm certainly not making excuses. But it's just a long sentence.
And just to point out to our listeners, I've seen you talk about this on other people's shows, and people who are watching, there's, if you're listening now in the audio, there's a video version available on our YouTube. I can tell looking at you when you talk about this that it's not something that you're brushing off. You committed a crime,
right? So
it's very clear.
Yeah, listen, I've said it. I absolutely deserve to go to prison. I committed a crime. I hurt people. I'm ashamed of it. And I wish I could, I wish it didn't happen. I wish I could take it back. But it just, the sentencing and the disparity in sentencing in U.S. justice system is just, it's out of control. I mean, people getting, essentially life sentences for, small drug conspiracies. It's, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, there's people in prison still right now, even after the First Step Act, after Obama's commutations and pardons that he did, still in prison for life for selling marijuana.
It's crazy. I became very good friends with one guy who was doing a 22-year bid for marijuana. And he hadn't sold marijuana when he got arrested for I don't know, it was 7 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, 22 years, but that really isn't much. You consider in this country, in Canada, it's legal. It's legal in many states now in the U.S. and it will be legal. And even if it becomes, legal federally, what are they going to keep these people in prison? Probably. Mm-hmm. Or they'll say, well, they broke the law at the time. It's a business. Prison's a business in the United States.
It definitely is. And I don't know. I know it's more marijuana, just to use that as an example, again, is more legal in Canada than it is in the United States. On the state level, some states are starting to legalize it recreationally, but they're not going back and retroactively, letting people out of prison, but they're letting people profit off it now that it's legal. So it's a messed up game. Not to get too far off topic, but I did want to ask you, so when you did end up in the MCC in New York, right? You were in prison, or you were in the same prison that El Chapo is in right now, right?
Right. So he's in an area called 10 South, which is it's the mother of all shoes in the United States. It's where they bring the worst of the worst. It's funny because I tell the story in my book. There's a chapter where I actually spent a couple of nights there because the regular shoe was full. So they brought me into this 10 South. And it was such a bizarre experience because the way the BOP works, Bureau of Prisons, it doesn't matter to them that I'm here for a low-level fraud and I'm going out. The reason I'm in a shoe is because they're taking me out for a colonoscopy. So what they do is they give you the prep and they put you in a shoe because that way you're in isolation, so you can deal with the prep that you have to take so the regular shoe. So they bring me to 10 South and they treat me like I'm a 9/11 terrorist, like I flew a plane into the World Trade Center. That's just the way it is. And so I spent 2 nights there where El Chapo is, but I was on a unit. I was on the 11th floor, 11 North, for the majority of my time. Mm-hmm. That's where, like John Gotti was and a lot of these high-level people. But and my wife was on the 2nd floor, so we were in the same building, separated though, because, men and women can never be together and can't even see each other.
So how long did you have to go without being able to see your wife?
Well, I would see my wife on legal co-defendant visits. Right. So every few months when the lawyers would come and bring us together downstairs, they would be short visits, maybe a half an hour. Mm-hmm. And other than that, they put me on a restriction, so there was a 5-day delay on my email to my wife or on any email to anyone. So I could actually send a letter from MCC in New York. The post office was across the street, and she'd probably receive a hard piece of mail before she'd get my email. It was just ridiculous. The whole thing was crazy. And then, of course, I'd call my kids at night and they'd give me whatever news because they'd speak to my wife, a few minutes before I called. So it was bizarre. You just let us email. It never made sense, but, that's the way they do things.
So with you and your wife both being in prison, I guess you had 2 of your kids were older in university, but did you have family that took care of your other kids? Or?
Yeah, my parents are elderly. They're still alive, thank God. And my father just turned 90. My mother's 84.
Oh, wow.
So when this happened, they were still pretty old. And they essentially had the younger ones. Initially, all of them moved in with them. And over time, my oldest daughter and my second daughter went out on their own. But they all supported each other. And, I thank God for it because I had a lot more in that respect. It's funny when you get locked up. But when you're in prison, it just puts you get a whole different perspective on what's important, right? Mm-hmm. And I realized I had a lot more than a lot of other guys who were locked up with me just because I had a close family. and a supportive family, and they were safe, because one thing when you're in prison, one of the worst things you could think about is going to that phone at night to make that phone call home and to get bad news. And I saw it countless times. And, it's a heart, even among men in prison, it's a gut-wrenching thing to see somebody go to a phone, make a call home and find out, somebody died or some tragic thing happened. You can't do anything about it. You can't help. You can't affect it. It's the worst thing imaginable. Much worse than something bad happening to us while we're in there, right?
Yeah, all you can do is sit there and think about it, worry about it.
It's terrible. So thank God I never experienced that.
So we were talking during our pre-show chat. You were saying that I'm in Pennsylvania. You said you've been to Pennsylvania, that you left, that ICE took you out. So when you were released, you were deported immediately to Canada?
Yeah, so I got extradited from Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, into the U.S. And once I was in the U.S., I was there illegally, even though you brought me here. So I'm there illegally. So now I'm a deportable alien with a felony. So ICE takes over. So the BOP has to release me to ICE. So what's interesting, of course, is that, my good fortune, I was released on Martin Luther King Day. So on Martin Luther, it was a holiday, so there was nobody from ICE to drive me to the border because it was a long weekend. So I was taken from BOP custody, federal custody, driven by an ICE officer locally to a county jail that was designated for ICE, and I had to spend one more night in the shoe there. And then the next morning, 2 ICE officers who worked in upstate Pennsylvania drove me to the Niagara border. So they took me from there. So I actually got, home a day later because of Martin Luther King Day. But, again, I'm not complaining.
So how has having a felony in the United States but living in Canada, how's that affected, your ability to everything that typically affects getting a place to live, getting a place to work or start a business, all that stuff? Yeah.
So look, first of all, I don't have a criminal record in Canada, and there's no record of my conviction. I don't have a felony, like a foreign conviction on my Canadian record. There's just no record because I didn't commit a crime here. I can't enter the United States because of my felony conviction. So, I'm not at the age where I'm applying for a job either. So, but the way I dealt with this whole thing is I just, as you know, I wrote a book about it. And I wasn't going to spend my life, keeping a secret or trying to skirt the issue or hope somebody didn't know or didn't find out. I just dealt with it right off, and it's out there. And if it's an issue for somebody, so be it. I don't really care. As far as I know, I committed a crime. I went to prison. We were punished. And, I'm very remorseful about what I did. But, how it's going to affect me. But to answer your question, realistically, in Canada has had no adverse effect on me. I got a passport. I got a driver's license. I got bank accounts. It could be a lot worse if you're an American released from prison.
Yeah.
And, you can't rent an apartment. You can't open a bank account. Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
It's craziness.
Yeah. Well, again, there's that business. It's designed to set you up to fail so they can bring you back.
Right.
Sounds cynical, I know, but you believe it after you lived it.
Well, it absolutely is. It's they say the prison system doesn't work. Well, it's working for the people who are running it.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
working for the people who are making money off of it. But I wanted to ask you, speaking of the book, so you talked about you just wanted to get it all out there, but what I guess question number one, other than that, what motivated you to really want to put in the time and the hours to write the book? And question number two, was it difficult for you? Did you have a background in writing? Was it something that came naturally?
You know what? I never wrote anything. I was in business, so I wrote papers. I guess, in school I wrote pretty good, but I had no idea. I started writing it without even a real plan to write a book. I got inspired by something that I read when I was in prison. And so I started writing it. And it was kind of like on a lark at the beginning. but you have all this time, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
You wake up early in the morning, you got all this time, and you kind of just, you got to keep a routine in prison, or else it's the time could kill you. You got to do something. So I started writing, and, by the time I got released, I had 34 chapters written of a 72 chapter book. And as it turns out, I'm apparently a pretty good writer and a good storyteller. I wasn't sure. I read it. I liked it. I'd let guys in prison that I was close to, I couldn't let them know. I couldn't let the guards know I was writing a book, and a lot of the content was about prison and where I was.
Because they'd come in and just destroy it, probably.
Oh yeah, I mean, they would have tossed my stuff, and they would have taken it away. They would have thrown me in a shoe, and they would have put me in what they call diesel therapy and shipped me all over the country, for sure. So I was always nervous about that. But I would go to a few guys who had been locked up for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And, I'd been in penitentiaries and mediums and lows, and I'd vet it with them, and they'd come back and they'd go, Canada, this stuff is unbelievable. This is great. And so I'd be like, really? If you find it, so interesting, a guy like who you've lived way much more than me. So that was the first indication that maybe there was something here. And then when I came home, I'd vet it with, friends and people I know. I'd say, hey, read a couple of chapters. And everybody would say, oh my God, it's unbelievable. Give me more, give me more. So I started to get a little more validation. And then ultimately I found an editor, and she was really not interested in editing any more books. She lived in Montreal, coincidentally, and I came across her through somebody. And so I met her, and she didn't want to know anything about me or my story, nothing. Every time I tried to tell her anything. So I met her for a coffee. She read the first chapter. She lifted her head. She said, let me get the second chapter. And she read it, and she looked at me. She said, I haven't edited a book in like 5 years because I'm so tired of editing crap. And she says, I'm going to edit your book. Wow. And I looked, and I realized, I got something here. After that, she did the editing. She told me initially it would take her about 2 months. And after 2 weeks, she called me and she told me she'd already finished chapter 33 or something. So she says, I can't put it down. The story's crazy. I said, really? She goes, yeah. She goes, listen, you could write. I said, oh, really? I had no idea. So she finished it pretty quickly, and I released it in September. Sorry. She started in July. September 16th, I released the book last year, 2018. And 2 days later, it was number one on Amazon in Canada. Yeah, in Canada.
So how'd you go about getting it published? Was that hard to do?
I self-published it.
Okay.
I actually had a publishing offer from one publisher, but I sort of quickly did the math, and I realized there's no money in it for me. I mean, I'd have to sell millions of books to actually see any money, and it's, they pay you so little. So I said, I didn't write the book for money. It wasn't a reason I wrote it. I didn't really write it for fame or money. I think if you ask me really, why did you write the book? It was really to try to sort of, mitigate this veil of shame that I left on my children. And just by telling the story, make people understand that, we're human beings and people make mistakes. And that's really what it was. It was a mistake. So that was my motivation for writing it. And so it wasn't about money. It was never about money. The fact that it's successful is nice. I'm certainly happy about it. But that wasn't the reason I wrote it. And so when it went to number one, I was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. It was kind of exciting. It was pretty satisfying,
Yeah, well, I think you published it probably at like the perfect time, because I know in the U.S., and it's probably similar in Canada, where, the criminal justice system, there's just a huge focus on it right now. A lot of it is about reforming it, but people are just really interested in learning about crime, why does it happen, learning about the stories behind it, like yours. So
yeah,
I'm not 100% sure what's driving that, but it seems to be universal across the board. So it's
it's probably the same reason we stop and look at a car crash, right?
Yeah.
People love watching, prison shows and stories about prison. And I guess it's sort of a fantasy, curiosity. And when they actually get to talk to somebody who lived through it, it's like hard for me to go out with people initially anyway, when I came home, where, the focus always became about that. And the next 3 hours would be talking about my experience.
Really? Just people just drilling you with questions?
Yeah. I mean, people all the time, they want to know, and they're subtle at first in their approach, but if they see, because they're not sure if I'm comfortable talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course I'm comfortable. I wrote a book about it. So, I don't want to talk about it all the time, but so people have questions. I don't mind answering their questions. So it always goes from one question to, 3 hours later, you're still, still explaining.
Plus, you're a good storyteller, so it's not helping you. People get you pull them in, and so.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, but Warren, I'm definitely going to pick this book up, and I know my listeners will too. I know they can get it on Amazon. Is there anywhere else that? And I'll link to that in the show notes page, of course. Anything else you're working on? I know we were talking about you have a Facebook and Instagram. What are those handles where people can check you out and follow you there?
It's at Warren Stelman on Instagram and Warren Stelman on Facebook. And I've got a very small YouTube channel that I haven't really put much effort into. It's hard, to put a lot of time into all these social media platforms.
It is.
It takes a lot of work, right? And kudos to people who do it, man, because morning to night. And so, life has sort of got back into a routine, and I've started to pursue some business interests and, working. But yeah, I mean, I try to support the book as much as I can. And it's available in all e-stores globally, wherever you can buy a book, an e-book. And, of course, in the States, Barnes & Noble. In Canada, it's available in retail stores.
Is there an audio version?
I started recording it. I went into the studio. Mm-hmm. Everybody said, do it in your own voice. I don't think I have a good audio voice. But I went into a studio. I started recording it. And I expect to finish it. It's just a matter of finding the time. So I think probably within the next 6 months, I'll release an audio version.
Yeah, I bet that would do really well too, honestly.
Yeah. I've never listened to an audiobook myself. But listen, a lot of people ask me, they say, listen, I'll buy the audiobook. I just don't have time to read. But when I'm in my car, I'd love to listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with audiobooks, it depends on the content. You don't want to read something real dry and something that's not interesting. But something like your book, I'm sure that would do really well in audio.
It's got a lot of exciting moments, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right, Warren. Well, I'll let you get going, and I just want to thank you again for coming on the show, sharing your story. And like I said, I'll link to your social media and where people can get the book on the show notes page. Any parting words before I let you go?
No, I just, I'd like to say that I think what you do is admirable. I think it's important. And obviously to bring any kind of focus on, I think the majority of people, the average person doesn't, the topic of prison reform or the justice system, I think people just accept for the most part, if somebody's in prison, they deserve to be there. Yeah, most people deserve to be there. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people that don't. And even if people deserve to be there, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be some kind of rehabilitation. You can't take young kids who come from if you don't mind these parting words, I think it's an important message.
No, it's very important.
Socioeconomic backgrounds that are disadvantaged to start with. They never had a chance. All they could do was go on a street corner and sell drugs to make money. That's all they knew. It's all they were taught. Throw them in prison and don't do anything with them. And it perpetuates a vicious cycle. They go back out. They have nothing else to do. Teach them something. Teach them to be a plumber, an electrician, to do something. Rehabilitate them in some way so they have a chance when they get out. And you realize after a while that they don't want them to have a chance because these prisons support too many people, too much industry, too many rural communities where everybody works at the prison, and it's an economic machine. But it's kind of sad. It's really, really sad. And I just think people need to understand that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 100%. And I know my audience is nodding their head along with everything you're saying there, because that's what we talk about constantly on this show. I mean, 100% the problem, and our prison systems are not striking the root. They're not addressing the causes of the problem. They're just actually making it a lot worse. But thanks again for coming on the show, man.
Thank you, John. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, and let's talk again soon.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. Have a good night.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode with Warren Stelman. He's a great storyteller and an excellent writer. I highly recommend picking up his book. I'm going to do so myself. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I know that he did share some really incredible, heart-wrenching stories with you today of his experience, what he went through. And, and Warren talked about it today. I mentioned it. I've seen him on many other shows. A lot of people will look at what he did and look at really the nature of his crime and say, well, that guy, he should have seen it coming. But this is a guy who's very remorseful for his crime. And one thing I want to make perfectly clear, which should be clear to anybody who's a sane person, that a crime like Warren's, first of all, in my view, it doesn't make any sense to put someone like that, to lock them in prison, especially in, an MCC type prison. And, he's not a violent person. It wasn't a violent crime. But on top of that, at the end of the day, a crime like his, where there's been fraud of some sort, some manipulation, misleading information, whatever, theft of funds in some way, putting someone in prison doesn't make sense, because at the end of the day, the goal should be to pay those people back. That is not the goal, though, of our legal system. It's not to get, these people their funds returned that they've lost. It's more from a punitive angle. So that's the way laws are written, or that's the way laws are written, and the way that it works, which I personally don't agree with. But with that being said, it's just completely ridiculous and insane, everything that he went to have to spend so much time in the Dominican prison there. It did really stop me. It stopped me in my tracks. And he was sharing the story about seeing a young man getting beaten to death in a Dominican prison. I know that stuff happens in the United States too. Probably happens a lot more frequently in third world countries like the Dominican Republic. And I think it's hard to argue against that, especially knowing everything that's been happening there recently, which is pretty terrifying stuff. Anyway, I digress. Please pick up Warren's book. I will link to it on the show notes page. You can shop through the Amazon link there. You can find the show notes page at lionsofliberty.com/FF181. And that will be a wrap for today's show. Got to keep this conclusion short. Got a bunch of stuff to do. Just want to remind you guys, if you like Felony Friday, if you like Lions of Liberty, you like what we're bringing to the table here, and you're like, could I say like anymore? I don't know. If you want us to expand this message and reach more people, we would love your help. We would love you to come on board as a patron, as a member of our Lions of Liberty Pride. Check out patreon.com/Lions of Liberty for more information. And thank you in advance for your generosity. That's a wrap for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.